Welcome back to the JMC True Crime channel. Thank you so much for tuning in. Today's case is groundbreaking. Today's case leads to a record being set. Now, you're likely wondering, what is so groundbreaking about today's case? What is it that leads to this record being set? These are two questions that I will have answered by the time today's video concludes. So, to not keep you waiting any further, strap in and let's get stuck in. John Tate and Kathleen Grosset met and began dating in Germany while they were serving in the military together. They would marry. Kathleen would assume John's surname and become Kathleen Grosset Tate, and of course we have John Tate. On the 30th of January 1987, they would welcome their first and only child together, a son, a bouncing baby boy, and his name would be Lionel Alexander Tate. John and Kathleen divorced shortly before Lionel's first birthday, and so, because he was so young, Lionel never really knew a life where his parents were together, where the three of them lived together all under one roof, and so his young life, his early years, consisted of a lot of shuffling, albeit shuffling between parent to parent, home to home, and in some cases, teacher to teacher. Now, his father John resided in Mississippi, and his mother Kathleen in Broward County, Florida, and Lionel primarily lived with his mother. Now, Broward County is a county located in southeast of Florida. It's the second most populous county and the 17th most populous in the entirety of the United States. I say this because the events of today's case will take place in Broward County. Lionel didn't have friends. At school, Lionel didn't have friends. He didn't have anyone to confide in. He didn't have peers that he could rely on for support. He just didn't really have anyone. Now, of course, he had teachers, but that's not the same thing. It's not the same dynamic. And so, as you can imagine, that is quite isolating. I remember reading a report where one of his teachers from the 5th grade said when Lionel was sitting at a desk, as soon as someone saw it was Lionel sitting there, they would walk away because they didn't want to sit next to him. He was completely alone in that aspect. Now, it would be naive to assume that it's purely coincidental, that no one wanted to be around him. The reason for this is honestly a result of Lionel's own behaviour. Lionel was quick to anger. He was known to yell and scream and terrorise his classmates in a place that, for them, and for him, should be a safe space. But Lionel made it unsafe. Now, it's easy to characterise Lionel as a bully, and I think that assessment would be correct. After all, a bully is defined as a person who seeks to habitually harm or intimidate those that they perceive to be vulnerable. And Lionel did just that. Not only did Lionel yell at his classmates, he would lie, he would steal their things, their pencils, their books, their pens, and he would fight. He would physically tussle with his classmates. He'd actually been suspended from school 15 times for doing this. He had a clear history of behavioural issues. In 1996, Lionel was 9 years of age, so still extremely young. He had gone to Mississippi to see John. John had since remarried, and so Lionel's new stepmother had the same issues with Lionel's behaviour as pretty much everyone else. He was quite unruly, he was very rude, she didn't know how to keep him in check, so to speak, and so it made the time he spent with them quite chaotic. Now, when Lionel did return home to his mother, Kathleen noticed quite the change within her son. Not only had he started to gain a lot of weight, it was almost as if he started to wear this badge of bully with pride. He was a bully, and people knew it. Now, what led to Lionel having this persona, this demeanour? That is a question I frankly can't answer. Perhaps it stemmed from his parents' divorce. Perhaps it stemmed from feeling isolated. Perhaps it stemmed from feeling like he's always going back and forth, back and forth. Or perhaps it had nothing to do with any of those things. Lionel, at this point, is 9 years old, and he's loud, he's aggressive, he's violent, and a bully. Okay, so now I want to swing back to Kathleen, Lionel's mother. Kathleen is a highway patrol trooper at this point. If you don't know, a highway patrol trooper's job is to oversee and enforce traffic safety compliances on roads and highways. So as you can imagine, this is a very important job. It's a job that requires you to work all hours, a lot of night work, and so your sleeping patterns will be greatly impacted by a role like this. I say this because this will be a crucial part of today's case. And I know, I've said today's case so many times, today's case, today's case, today's case. So, how about instead of me saying those words once again, I actually just tell you what exactly I mean. I do have one final piece of background information to share before we go into the main course of today's video. Now, Kathleen grew up in Jamaica, and in Jamaica she had a close childhood friend called Doozy. Now, Kathleen and Doozy, they knew each other as they were quite young, but as they grew, naturally their lives just went in different directions. Opposing directions, you could say, but there were some similarities. They both would go on to get married, they both would go on to get divorced, and they both would go on to have one child each. As we know, Kathleen had Lionel, and Doozy had Tiffany. Now, in 1999, Tiffany was a 6-year-old girl. She was bright, she was bubbly, she just looked to be full of energy. I've looked at pictures of her, and honestly, she was just so cute. Sometime, likely in 1999, Kathleen and Doozy, they reconnected as friends. It was great, they still had things in common, despite having had so much time apart, possibly in connection to their respective marriages and their children. And so, that's why Doozy thought nothing of it to ask her good friend Kathleen to watch her beloved daughter Tiffany for the night. And on the 28th of July, 1999, that's exactly what she did. Kathleen agreed. Doozy and Tiffany, they pull up to Kathleen's home, the home that she of course shares with Lionel, and she drops Tiffany off. She gives her daughter a kiss, she tells her she loves her, and she says goodbye. And this was quite joyous because the very next day, Tiffany was so excited to get to go to Disney World for the first time. For the first time, and she's only 6 years old. Anyone can be excitable, but this is Disney World we're talking about. I'm 24. If my mum wants to come downstairs and tell me she's taking me to Disney World, I'll be excitable too. Don't have to hold me back. And so you can imagine that Tiffany was just looking forward to the very next morning so she can go to Disney World. And Doozy was equally excited to share that experience with her beloved daughter. Little did Doozy nor Tiffany know that would be the last time they see each other. That evening, Kathleen prepared a meal for Lionel and Tiffany to enjoy, and after that, both kids retired to the couch just so they could relax and watch some TV. Not too long after that, Kathleen decided to go upstairs and try and get some rest because she had an overnight shift coming up, and so she did need to relax a bit in preparation for it. At 10 p.m, Kathleen would yell down to the kids to both be quiet as she had heard a scream. Now, Kathleen had obviously, or at least I assume, not thought much of this as she didn't go downstairs to check what the scream was the result of. But she would soon find out. Roughly 40 minutes later, Lionel would come upstairs and tell his mother that Tiffany was not breathing. Kathleen, hearing this, frantically dashes downstairs to check on Tiffany, and when she sees the state that Tiffany is in, she calls 911. Despite best efforts made to save her young life, 6-year-old Tiffany Eunick would die that day. Lionel's explanation for Tiffany's injuries, which I will go on to list very shortly, was that they had been play wrestling, that he had her in a headlock and she accidentally hit her head on the table. That's what Lionel said, anyway. So, to paint a clear picture, Lionel was 12 years old, Tiffany was 6. Lionel weighed approximately 170 pounds, and Tiffany approximately 48 pounds. Not only was he double her age, he was 3 times her size and could easily overpower her. At first, Tiffany's death was thought to be accidental. Tragic regardless, but accidental. That is, until her autopsy was conducted. The medical examiner reported that Tiffany suffered more than 35 injuries. And to name a few, we have a fractured skull, brain contusions, ruptured spleen, a partially detached liver, dozens and dozens of bruises, a liver laceration, and a damaged rib cage. Now, let that sink in for just a second. Here we have Lionel saying that they were play wrestling, and then go back to this list of Tiffany's injuries. Does that make sense? Does that add up? Does the equation of 2 plus 2 get you to 4? No. No, it doesn't. Doozy remembers getting the phone call from Kathleen sometime after 11 p.m. that night, asking her if Tiffany had any problems with asthma, given the fact she wasn't breathing. And in that moment, Doozy just knew. She knew her baby was gone. And when she got to the hospital that night, her instincts were proved correct. Now, with regards to the autopsy report, this was sent to the Broward County Sheriff's Office, and it was then when Lionel became a suspect, roughly 2 days after Tiffany had died. Because again, if we go back to Lionel's reasoning and cross that with Tiffany's injuries, it just doesn't make sense. Okay, so before we move on, I do want to pose a question. Kathleen, Lionel's mother, she knew that her son could be violent. She knew that he had a history proving exactly this. She knew that he could easily overpower Tiffany if he wanted to. Was she negligent, leaving the two alone in a room? Was it incompetence? Was it a lack of care? Or was it just simple mindlessness because she was tired and wanted to have a nap? What's the answer? Let me know. Shortly after Tiffany's death, the police did question Lionel. They believed that he had beaten Tiffany and concealed it to avoid getting into trouble. And because of this, the prosecutor, in this case being Kenneth Padowitz, did make the difficult decision to try Lionel as an adult. Now, this definitely would have been a difficult decision because Lionel is 12 years old, and so to try him as an adult means that he would get a far more severe sentence if he were to be found guilty. It was the severity of Tiffany's injuries that prompted Padowitz to try Lionel as an adult. He believed that the juvenile system at that time in Florida would merely give Lionel about, let's say, 6 to 9 months in juvenile detention, and again, going back to the severity of what Tiffany endured, that just didn't seem like an appropriate sentence. So let's push on to 2001, early 2001. It had been agreed that Lionel would be tried as an adult for first-degree murder. Now, the prosecution didn't necessarily believe that Lionel intended to kill Tiffany. However, the case still fell under felony murder because it was the result of aggravated child abuse. Now, if you didn't already know, felony murder is a legal rule that essentially expands the definition of murder. It applies when someone commits a certain kind of felony and someone else dies as the result of it. In this case, Lionel beat Tiffany quite savagely, and she then died from her injuries. That then classifies this to be felony murder. So, as the trial had now begun, Lionel's defence team, led by James Lewis, argued that Lionel and Tiffany had been play fighting and play wrestling, and Lionel, being larger than the average size of a boy his age, he didn't realise his own strength and accidentally killed her. Now, this did actually garner a lot of national attention because this defence was very strange. As a matter of fact, the World Wrestling Federation would later issue a statement saying that the defense's strategy was a contrived hoax. And I say strange because Tiffany's injuries were not consistent with play fighting or play wrestling. They were consistent with, in my opinion, and that of many others, intent, having been intentionally and brutally beaten. The prosecution disagreed with the defense. They believed that Tiffany's injuries had been far too severe to have been sustained accidentally. Padowitz said that Lionel beat her with his fists, stomped on her, punched her, and kicked her, all of this over the course of 5 minutes. Now, if you think about it, 5 minutes is not a long period of time. It's 300 seconds. 5 minutes is how long it takes to boil a kettle and make a cup of tea. 5 minutes is how long it takes to, iron a t-shirt. 5 minutes, not long. Except 5 minutes is long if you're going through what Tiffany went through. I can only imagine that 5 minutes must have felt endless. Must have felt endless. And don't forget, there was an adult upstairs, and Tiffany did scream, but that scream didn't help her. It did nothing for her. Now, in this video, of course, I'm covering Lionel Tate, and I'm going to be speaking on a lot of key moments in his life. But don't forget about Tiffany here. Tiffany was a 6-year-old girl, and she was discarded in such an appalling way. As the trial started to approach its end, Padowitz and Deweese, Tiffany's mother, became concerned that Lionel would be given a long prison sentence. Deweese, still grieving the loss of her beloved daughter, still had compassion for Lionel. She didn't want him to face the remainder of his life behind bars. Bear in mind, we're in January of 2001, so Lionel is only 14, he's still extremely young, he still has his whole life ahead of him. And like I said, Deweese, she still had mercy for him to not want to subject him to life in prison. With that in mind, Padowitz approached Lionel's defense team and Kathleen, Lionel's mother, to offer a plea bargain. The plea bargain consisted of reducing the charge to second-degree murder, and so Lionel would have to serve 3 years in a juvenile facility, followed by 1 year of house arrest, and 10 years of probation with psychological counselling and therapy. An excellent deal, I might add. Lionel did not accept this deal, or better yet, I should say Lionel's mother, Kathleen, did not accept this deal. Now, I've done a lot of research on this case, and a lot of reports have stated that Kathleen didn't want her son to serve even a day behind bars, which is absurd to me if true. I completely appreciate that this is her son, so naturally she wants to protect him. That's the role of any parent. But I do think there is a fine line between protecting and enabling, and if it is true that Kathleen didn't want Lionel to serve even a day behind bars, I would say that falls closer toward enabling rather than protecting. In January of 2001, roughly 18 months since Tiffany's death, the jury had deliberated for 2 weeks and they came back with the verdict. They had found Lionel to be guilty of first-degree murder. With this conviction came the sentencing of life in prison without the possibility of parole. At the time of Lionel's sentencing, the judge, his name being Joel T. Lazarus of Broward County Circuit Court, said, and I quote, "The acts of Lionel Tate were not the playful acts of a child. The acts of Lionel Tate were cold, callous, and indescribably cruel." Lionel's sentencing drew heavy criticism. Even the prosecution, the very people who wanted to try Lionel for felony murder in the first place, they were stunned. Even they didn't expect for a 14-year-old boy to be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This sentence led to a lot of questions. It begged the question of how America prosecutes its youth. What is the right course of action when one child is the reason for the death of another? Is the correct thing to do to take the life of the child that's still living and put them behind bars? Lionel is now known as the youngest person in the entirety of the US to ever have been sentenced to life without the possibility of parole for felony murder. Now, as I said before, the prosecution, along with so many other people, were very taken aback by the severity of Lionel's sentencing. The judge, Lazarus in this case, he did push back and said, essentially, if you felt like him being convicted for felony murder was too much, why would you try him for felony murder? And if we're being fair, the judge had a good point. You can't exactly try him for felony murder and then be surprised when he's convicted of felony murder. Now, we do know that the prosecution did offer a plea bargain, which was rejected, but the point does stand. The mandatory sentencing for felony murder is a life sentence, and so it really can't be that surprising that once he's found guilty, or when he was found guilty, that's the sentencing he received. And this isn't me saying that the sentencing was right or wrong. I'm actually in two minds, but facts are facts. Lionel's father, John, was also shocked that his son had been sentenced to life behind bars. He was equally surprised that Kathleen, his ex-wife, had rejected the plea deal. That plea deal would have meant that his son would be out from behind bars by the age of 17, 1 year of house arrest to 18, and then 10 years of probation, and then he could go on and live his life. But that's not exactly how things would play out. In the following years, Lionel would serve his sentence at the Okeechobee Juvenile Offender Correction Center. Kathleen, his mother, never stopped fighting for him. She wanted a retrial, she wished for clemency. Clemency is essentially asking for grace, it's asking for mercy, and I do think that there were solid grounds to ask that or to request that for Lionel, given the age that he committed the crime and the age that he was convicted. Absolutely, he should be punished for the crime, but is punishing him with life sentence without parole too much? Some would say yes. Lots would say yes. In December of 2003, almost 3 years since Lionel was imprisoned, the Florida prosecutors again offered the same plea bargain to Lionel, the one that Kathleen had rejected almost 3 years prior, meaning that he would serve 3 years in a juvenile detention, 1 year of house arrest, and 10 years of probation. And this time, the plea bargain was accepted. At this point, though, Lionel had served almost 3 years, so he didn't have much longer to go. He would have to plead guilty to second-degree murder, which he did, and on the 27th of January 2004, 3 days shy of his 17th birthday, Lionel was freed. He walked out of the juvenile facility, hand in hand with his mother, likely overjoyed to finally be back in society. And I wish that was the end of the story. I wish I could say that Lionel completed his 1 year of house arrest and learnt how to become a contributing and beneficial member of society, and that he didn't go on to reoffend. I wish I could say those things. Well, technically I could say those things, but I would be lying, and I don't want to lie to you, so unfortunately this story is about to go in a different direction. On the 3rd of September 2004, Lionel was arrested because he had violated the terms of his plea bargain. Lionel's plea bargain meant that he was on zero-tolerance probation, and because he had been found to be carrying a 4-inch knife, which clearly violated those terms, his probation was increased from 10 years to 15. And on the 23rd of May 2005, when Lionel was 18, he was charged with armed burglary, with battery, armed robbery, and violation of probation. Lionel had greeted a Domino's pizza delivery man, his name being Walter Gallardo, with a handgun after phoning in an order. Walter dropped the 4 pizzas in a panic and fled the scene. Lionel then entered the apartment and assaulted the occupant who didn't want Lionel to be there. Walter called 911 and then returned to the scene to identify Lionel. And I should mention that no gun was recovered. I say this because Lionel will later go on to admit that he had violated probation by possessing a gun, but one hadn't been recovered, and so without his admission, there would be no proof of this. Despite his admission of having had a gun, he refused to answer where he got it and where he disposed of it. On the 1st of March 2006, Lionel did accept a plea bargain and was going to be sentenced to 30 years of imprisonment, but he was later allowed to withdraw his guilty plea. However, he would finally be sentenced to 30 years in prison on the 18th of May 2006 for violating probation, and on the 24th of October 2007, Florida's 4th District Court of Appeal upheld that sentence. On the 19th of February 2008, Lionel would plead no contest to the robbery and would be sentenced to 10 years in state prison. This sentence would run, and is currently running, concurrently with his 30-year sentence for violating probation. He is currently imprisoned in the Charlotte Correctional Institution. Assuming that Lionel is on good behaviour for the remainder of his sentence, and let's say he doesn't reoffend when he does get released, it is a sad thought to know that he will have spent majority of his young life behind bars. Of course, this is his own fault. It's his behaviour that's gotten him here. He's particularly violent, and he did reoffend multiple times even after he was released back when he was 17 with regards to Tiffany's murder. For me, it just begs the question of how did we get here? Lionel was showing traits of, violence, of brutality, bullying, he was stealing, he was lying, all that and the other, even when he was in his early years of life. So, as I said, how did we get here? Is it nature? Is it nurture? Is it a combination of both? Was Lionel always destined to become this kind of person? Or was he influenced to be this way? Now, I know that a question like this doesn't really have an answer, or at least it doesn't have a simple answer. It's just, with cases like these where the child is a killer, it always leaves me a bit baffled. Where does this mindset come from? And what influences a child killer to act? Well, like I said, the cases aren't getting any lighter, but if you've made it to this point in the video, I'm very, very grateful. Please do be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. That does help me to get more visibility, and with that will come more videos. Thank you again. JMC out.